that can be created in M365, O365, and Azure. But out of all those groups, there are multiple types of security groups. There are two distinctions. You can say there's one is a type of security group, and the other type is a distribution list. Now, distribution list is just a list used for sending emails. You can create two types of distribution list. One is your static distribution list, and one is a dynamic distribution list. A distribution list is predominantly sending emails, like bulk sending emails to multiple people, right? So, for example, if you have a small group of people, like let's say us, and you want to send emails to all users within this session. So I would add all the users in this session to a distribution list. Name the distribution list maybe Azure AD Training 1.0 at rapidcircle.com. And all of us are added to the distribution list. So instead of typing multiple email addresses in the to field in Outlook, I can just type in the Azure AD Training underscore 1.0 distribution list email address, and it'll send it to all of us. Another type is a dynamic distribution list, which can be created based on rules. For example, if all of us are in the same department, like let's say finance, I can have an attribute which is department equals finance. So I can create a distribution list with the term department equals where users have department equals finance. And so every time someone gets removed from the department, automatically the dynamic distribution list updates. And if someone gets added to the department and their department is changed to finance, they automatically add it to that dynamic distribution list. So it is membership based, and the membership is written into that distribution list. Yeah. So we understood distribution lists, right? There's no security enabled on distribution list, correct?
Yes.
So now we'll talk about security groups. Security groups, they're basically security principles that can be used to secure objects in Azure AD. They are predominantly used to collect a list of objects and assign permissions. The two things that a security group can do. Security group is a collection of objects, and that collection of objects can be assigned permissions to a resource. So it makes management easy. Administration and management is easy through security groups. For example, I want to give all users in finance or all users in this training session access to maybe a folder in SharePoint. So if I create a security group, which is AAD training security group, add all the users in this training to that security group, all I need to do is assign that security group access to that folder in SharePoint, which will contain all the documents. And since I assign that security group permissions to that folder, all the users within that security group will inherit those permissions. That too makes management a lot easier. Yep. So this session will be a little shorter because it is predominantly around security groups. We discussed in the previous slide that security groups are service principles used to secure objects in Azure Active Directory. Their membership can either be static, just like a dynamic group and your dynamic distribution list and your distribution list. So you can have a static security group, which can be users within this training, or a dynamic security group, which can be based on an attribute that's set for the user. For example, if user's department is finance, automatically the user will get added to that dynamic security group. Now, these groups can be created in Azure Active Directory, or they can be synced from on-premises as well. And there are organizations that prevent syncing of security groups from on-premises, but you usually create security groups on-premises, and it makes management easier since those security groups can replicate to Azure Active Directory, and then you can assign permissions. Yep. One thing to note is groups that are synced from on-premises cannot be edited or managed in Azure Active Directory. And that holds true not just for security groups, it holds true for all objects. For example, if you sync a user to Azure Active Directory, you cannot modify that user. You would have to modify that user on premises in AD and then sync those changes to Azure Active Directory. Similar to users, you have security groups where security groups cannot be managed at all when it comes to online, if it is synced. Got it? Now you have different types of security groups. For distribution lists, you only have two types of lists. One is dynamic, one static. For security groups, you have your regular static security groups, which can be used to grant access to many resources, not just SharePoint sites, but there are any type of resources that can be granted access, right? You then have mail-enabled security group, which is also used to grant access, but there's an email address associated with it. So if I send an email to that security group, all users within that security group will receive that email since it's a mail-enabled security group. This can be used to send emails and assign permissions. Your dynamic security groups, similar to security groups, the only difference is the membership rules. So the membership within those dynamic security groups are dynamic. If a user is added to finance department, the user is automatically added to the group, thus would inherit permissions to, let's say, that SharePoint site. If a user is removed from that dynamic security group, the user would be removed from that SharePoint site, or the permissions wouldn't be granted anymore. The last type, and one which is very collaboration oriented, would be your M365 groups or unified groups. Now, these groups are used for collaboration purposes. They do have an email list associated with it. They are security enabled. They are used for collaboration. So they do have a shared mailbox. They do have a shared calendar. They have a SharePoint document library attached to it. They have a planner, OneNote Notebook, Power BI, and Stream. Now, if this group can also be created in Yammer, Teams, and Roadmap. So if it is created in Yammer, there would be a Yammer site associated with that group. If it's created in MS Teams, so whenever you create an MS Team, there is an M365 group or a unified group that is created in the backend. So if it's created in Teams, there's a Teams associated with it. And Roadmap if you have a project on the web. Now, this is a brief chart of security groups. They are not mail enabled. They are not dynamic membership. Mail enabled security groups, they are mail enabled. The membership is not dynamic. Dynamic security groups, they are not mail enabled and their membership is dynamic. And lastly, you have the unified group or the M365 group, which is both mail enabled and the membership can also be dynamic. Now, for all collaboration purposes, you would use an M365 group since you have all these other collaboration features that are attached to this group. So it's good for when you're working in teams or in a team that is a part of a project. Yeah. Now, with that, it was quite an open session since it is about groups. The next topic will be brought to you by Manu and Tejas, who will talk about service principles. Yep.